It must be said, what a day today outside, right? Yeah, you can clap for sunshine. I clap for sunshine, especially in November. It was beautiful. What a gift. And tonight, what a gift to hear this word of the Lord from the book of Genesis. Now, the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him, and when he saw them, he ran from the entrance of his tent to meet them, and he bowed down on the ground. And he said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring you a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." So Abraham hastened to the tent to tell Sarah, and he said, "Make ready quickly 3 choice measures of flour, and knead it, and make cakes." And then he ran to the herd and chose a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then he took the curds and the milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and Sarah will have a child." Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, and it had ceased to be with Sarah in the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I now have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is there anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time, I will return to you, and Sarah will have a child." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This story highlights 2 of my favorite things, 2 of life's greatest gifts: hospitality and laughter. There is nothing like somebody opening up their home to you, giving you the prized seat at the table, and as the candles drip and the glasses again refilled as dessert is brought around, they linger with you, listening to your stories, giving you full attention as they share of themselves and give you their time. There's nothing like this when you can laugh or cry, and on a good night, perhaps a little bit of both. There is nothing like this that makes you feel more welcome, like you fit, like you belong. I love gathering around the table with my friends, whether it be their table or mine. And I've had some of the best meals and some of the best conversations and encounters with God than I can think of. When I moved to the Dominican Republic after graduating from Hope College, it didn't take long, however, to realize that I had much to learn about hospitality. See, this is a culture where you cannot help but feel welcome and loved as people are continually offering up their seats, welcoming strangers into their homes, and forever trying to get you to stay for just one more cafecito. One of my first lessons of hospitality came from a man named Pavel. And Pavel was a volunteer young life leader who had a knack for stopping by just around dinner time, and had a lacking of understanding of basic social cues that said, it's really time for you to be moving on now. And I was living with my friend and coworker Tracy at the time, and she had been learning about hospitality from Pavel long before I arrived on the scene. And I remember her saying to me, that she used to get so frustrated with Pavel's interruptions in her life until two things happened. One, she took the time to listen to his story and learn about his life. And two, she stopped seeing them as interruptions. The second part, I realize, is the true mark of hospitality. While a lover of hospitality, I realized what I was a lover of controlled hospitality. On my terms, when I had the time, and when I extended the invitation. Now, it was also upon moving to the Dominican Republic that I learned quickly that a sense of humor was key to survival. A life that consists of daily power outages, no matter what time of day or for how long, you don't know. A life where chickens and roosters have no sense of timing and run wild even in city neighborhoods. A life where you can go to Pizza Hut and learn that, sorry, we're not serving pizza today, is a life that demands flexibility and a good sense of humor. Now, while I managed to learn to shake my head and laugh at minor inconveniences, I was also continually blown away by people whose lives were wrought with more challenges and hardships than I will ever know, who managed to walk with a humorous side of life. In our text today, we see hospitality at its finest and laughter as a survival instinct. We're told that 3 men appeared in the desert to Abraham and that this very encounter is God. Abraham moves quickly then to welcome them, which I do think it's funny to think of a 90-ish-year-old man moving quickly, what that actually means. But we're told that he moves quickly and he hastens and he runs from here to there, making preparations. You see, this is no quick pit stop for the visitors. The calf has yet to be slaughtered, and the bread dough has yet to be kneaded. It is after the day of preparations that they sit down to eat. And the Lord speaks to Abraham and says that when they come back next year, in due season, Sarah indeed will have a child, that God's promise will finally come to fruition. And we're told that Sarah is in the tent as the 3 strangers acting in one accord reveal to Abraham, and not Sarah, the big plans that God has for her body. In due season, her postmenopausal body will bear a son. Upon hearing this declaration from the shadow of her home's entrance, the news is so jarring that she has a physical reaction. An uncontainable rush of energy goes through her veins and bursts out of her. She laughs. In a private moment to herself, she lets her guard down. She opens herself to imagine the reality of her and Abraham conceiving a child together at their age. And she lets the weight of the news hit her. She engages, she feels, she reacts, she laughs. And it is here that we see that while this story is indeed a story of hospitality, and while this story indeed shows the gift of laughter, this story is ultimately a story about a question posed to a man and a woman upon again hearing the unbelievable, nonsensical, the in a very real sense inconceivable promise of God. A question that indeed does echo down the canyons of time to us today, for this is not only the question of them, but this story of the inconceivable is in our lives. And it's the question that for us as the people of God lies at the crux of our faith. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Now, the Hebrew word translated here as wonderful can also be rendered as miraculous or astonishing or difficult. Thus, another way to ask the question is anything too difficult for God? Or put even more simply, is God God or not? This is an overwhelming question, a question that shatters into our reality. And unlike our questions in communication with one another that often sneak and tiptoe around what we're really trying to say or communicate, this one cuts right to the heart of the matter. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Answer yes. And as one preacher puts it, the world is shut down, the universe closed, and God is no longer God. Benevolent, maybe. Kindly concerned, perhaps, but as powerless as we are in the face of our cosmic incongruity. Answer no. No. There is nothing too hard for God. And you and the world are in God's hands, and the possibilities are endless. For if we do believe this, that nothing is too hard for the Lord, then we can no longer be content to live life as business as usual. Wild and crazy things can happen and usually do, for embracing the promise of God involves shattering and discontinuity. Just as Abraham and Sarah are asked to believe the impossible, that new life can and will come from barrenness and hopelessness, we too are asked to believe in the dismal and hopeless as things may seem in our lives, that nothing, absolutely nothing, is so far gone that God cannot redeem it. Is there anything too wonderful for the Lord? A fair warning, however. When God shows up on your doorstep, you had better be prepared to be shaken out of your customary and stable and reliable life. Listen to how author Annie Dillard puts this. She says, on the whole, I don't find Christians outside of the catacombs sufficiently sensible of the conditions. Does anyone have the foggiest idea of what sort of power we blissfully invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are children playing on the floor with chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It's madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews, for the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense, or the waking God may draw us out and we can never return. See, the question at the crux of our faith becomes, do we really want to believe that with God there is nothing that is impossible? Do we want to abandon our controlled life for a life of faith where the inconceivable will happen more often than not? Or are we comfortable and resigned to leave things the way they are? You see, at this point in the Sarah story, I would imagine that Abraham and Sarah had grown somewhat accustomed to their barrenness. They've accepted that perhaps hopelessness is normal. But the gospel promise meets them and demands a response, and they are asked, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? And just as Sarah and Abraham sense a discongruity between what is promised and their reality, we too encounter this more often than not. We too laugh because we think we will never get free from our past, that we'll keep making the same dumb decisions we made last night, that we will never find someone to love us, we'll never want to go home again, that we'll never be happy, that we'll never feel loved again. We laugh at the ironies of a life of faith that promises that the first will be last, and that in order to gain life, you must lose your life. And we are asked, is there anything too wonderful for the Lord? Faith is by no means a reasonable act. And the promise of God is just not a conventional piece of wisdom that fits in nicely with the rest of our lives. Just as Abraham and Sarah laughed because they reached a dead end in their lives and had adjusted to it, we too, if we're honest, accommodate ourselves to all the barren places in our lives and our call to believe that God will do something nonsensical. Is there anything too wonderful for the Lord? It's important to note this statement from the Lord does not come as a proposition. It doesn't come as an assertion or a proclamation, but as a question. It comes as a question because the gospel requires a decision. And the decision cannot be given from above. It must come from below. It must come from Sarah and Abraham. It must come from us. Equally important to note that while this question demands an answer, God's promise does not depend on our answer. In our story today, Sarah responds in laughter and follows God's question not with an answer, but a denial. I did not laugh. And God fulfills God's promise despite our lack of faith, despite our inability to answer on the spot with a resounding, wholehearted no, nothing is too difficult for you. And hear this clearly. Simply because nothing is too wonderful for the Lord does not mean that every desirable thing is possible. What is possible is characterized only as everything promised by God. That is only what corresponds to God's good purposes. This text does not, as Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann suggests, permit a casual triumphalism that simply believes that everything is possible. Because of the character of God, everything is possible for those who stay through the dark night of barrenness with God. You see, the impossibility of God is not painless. It is not tension-free. And it does not allow us to float through life without a care. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's often painful and demands persistence and patience when all we want to do is give up hope. And therein lies the rub, for you see that we see in God's only Son, as he prays before his death for God to remove this cup before him, we see that what God will not do is circumvent the reality of suffering, the reality of hurt, the reality of the cross. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? You who are faithful, who come and sing that God reigns on high, may be wondering, well then why did he have to die? For those of us who come, the faithful, wondering, of course God can, but he doesn't, does he? So how is this supposed to help me? Will I ever be able to shake this weight of depression? Why is my mom walking out on our family? Why does he keep hitting me if he says he loves me? Why did she have to get sick? Will I ever find a job? Why was my love rejected again? I do not know. But this I do know, that God is big enough to handle all your questions, all of them. And that when you can't believe that new life is possible, there are others who believe for you. And as you send God your questions, he more than likely will send one right back to you. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? You see, just as Sarah and Abraham can no longer live pre-promise, given the death, resurrection, and the promise of Jesus coming again, we neither can live pre-promise. Even though we live with barrenness and wonder if God has heard our prayers, even though we live with the doubt that comes from yet another shattering disappointment, and often as we settle for less, because less is what is before us now, even though we still believe. And we laugh. We believe and we laugh with those who laughed before us, those who have seen barrenness bring new life, those who have seen that not even death on a cross can stop life. And despite all the evidence that points otherwise, God's kingdom is breaking in now, and Jesus Christ is coming again? Is there anything too wonderful for the Lord? And as we wait for this full redemption, this full transformation, which might look differently than we think, it's critical that we keep our sense of humor in the fullest meaning of the word. For when laughter goes, so does our hope. Our lives are full of waiting. And as someone has once said, the only worse thing than waiting is waiting without laughing. And not only must we keep our sense of humor, but we also must keep an openness and a willingness to be surprised by the seemingly impossible. We must learn to expect the unexpected. We must be prepared to encounter the living God on our doorstep and in places we least anticipated. We must expect to hear the voice of God from the mouths of those who we are quick to dismiss as outsiders, as strangers or other. And all the while continually asking ourselves, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.